If you want to pull him back a little bit. Got a little bit. Keep talking, Doc.
You want me to keep talking?
Yeah.
You're going to want me to shut up as soon as we start?
That's better. Yeah. That's good. Okay, you've talked enough. All right. All right, guys. Hey, welcome. We're glad that you're here. We're at time. We're ready to get started on this. If you're new to the room, what we like to do is Doc and I will just do a quick follow-up. Not a quick follow-up. We'll spend an hour talking about what we talked about in 30 minutes on Sunday. That's what we like to do. So we actually do it slower, but we'll just kind of go through same kind of content, just follow up. Can go a lot of different ways. It can be pieces that we want to take deeper. That's what Doc did last week. Some of the things he talked about, he just wanted to expound on them and look deeper. Tonight we're going to kind of hit some things that I didn't get to talk about on Sunday morning predominantly. We're going to deal with some extra pieces that are kind of outlying around predominantly from what we were able to talk about on Sunday morning. And so tonight we're going to be talking about gentleness. Just a couple things. This is going to be interactive for you. So if you've got a question or if you want to make a comment about how dumb I am, and I'm going to give you opportunities, I'm promising you right now, you're going to have a great opportunity, okay? So I'm going to set that up. You feel free to raise your hand, and Vern has Vern has a microphone that he'll bring around when he's in and let you participate in that kind of way. That way we can hear what you're saying, everybody can hear what you're saying, and we work together like that really well. And here in a moment, we'll also be passing around a little sheet for attendance. If you've been here before in the last few weeks, you should be able to find your name really easy. Just put a check mark and pass it along. If it's your first time, that's fine. Just write your name at the bottom. The information that we're asking for, I believe, is a phone number and an email address. Just helps us. Again, we like to see what people are doing, what they're going to, and how they're interacting with the things that we offer. We track that stuff closely to make sure that what we're doing is useful and helpful. So if you could help us out with all that, we'd really appreciate that. Anything else? Do you want to say anything about how dumb I am yet?
Heavens, no. He's going to be my boss shortly. I'm not going to do that.
But not tonight, and you've got excellent opportunities. I'm going to just set it up. All right, it's going to be great.
I've learned you have a memory.
That's also true. All right. Doc, why don't you pray first and we'll get started?
I'll do it. Father, so grateful that we can be here and study together. Be able to study with family is a gift. Be able to study your word is a gift. In fact, everything good in our life is your gift, and we're grateful. And we want to learn more about that because we want our lives to be richer. We want you to be proud of us as your kids. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
All right. So we're doing a marriage series, and really what that means is not much, okay? Really what we're doing is we're doing a fruit of the Spirit, a character series is what this is. This is the things that we're talking about are things that Jesus followers do. That's what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus and how to live like him. What we're doing is we're bringing specific application to marriage. We're using marriages as the kind of the location of how we're playing out these principles and things that we're teaching. And so that's what this series has been. We talked about gentleness on Sunday. One of the things, before we start talking about gentleness, one of the things that Doc and I have been talking about a lot lately in this series that we've wrestled with significantly is where is the motivation? Okay? So when we sit and we talk about marriage, we talk about these character traits of being more like Jesus, however you want to play this out, okay? However that applies to you. What is the motivation? What is the thing that's actually going to get change? What's the kind of thing that's going to make you choose to be different? That's going to make you choose to live differently, to think differently? What's it going to look like to try to actually say that this was worth something? Does that make sense? Okay? And we wrestle with that quite frequently, okay? Usually as we are preparing sermons and working for the material that we're going to present on a Sunday morning, quite frequently we struggle with two things. We struggle with application and motivation, okay? We struggle with being able to tell you exactly what to go do with this, and we struggle with telling you exactly why you should even care, all right? Like those are kind of the two stumbling blocks that we wrestle with quite frequently, okay? And so it got me thinking, where's the motivation? And I don't know that this is a comprehensive list, meaning this is everything, okay? But as I've worked through it, I think that there's some useful answering to this, okay? Because I think all of us are motivated in different kinds of ways. I think it's valuable for us to kind of pause for a moment and think through what motivates you, what makes you do the things that you do, okay? And so take it outside of marriage. For me, I went towards working out. which I have so very little motivation for, all right? I have negative amounts of motivation when it comes to working out. And so I started thinking through what are the things that cause other people to go work out, and what are the things that it would take to get me to choose to go and work out, okay? What's it going to look like? And I kind of broke it down into 3 different categories: discipline, desire, and desperation, okay? So discipline, some people, not everybody, and not everyone with everything, but some people in some areas are extremely self-disciplined. For whatever reason, they have an ability to just kind of lock themselves in and do the work of what they're supposed to do, okay? And so I think that there's some people who work out simply because there's a discipline of them doing it, and they have the ability to just kind of hold themselves accountable and stick to it. Does that make sense? Some people actually like it. They're the ones that I don't get, all right? There's some people who enjoy the process of going in and working out and then being sore the rest of the day. Like, that makes 0 sense to me. I can't comprehend that one at all, okay? But some people just have the desire. They know that it's good for them, and so they do it. These are the same people who eat healthy, and they, like, go to bed early, and they wake up early, and all that kind of stuff. It's not me. I can't hardly even stand those people, all right? Which comes into the marriage issue because it's my wife, all right? And so you got that. And then the third one is desperation. Sometimes you'll see people show up to work out because they have to. They've reached a point in life where if they don't, something worse is going to happen. Does that make sense? Okay. Last fall, I actually worked out pretty consistently for about 6 weeks, which was probably like a lifetime record for me, especially since like getting out of high school. So did it for a time, and it was largely because I could just feel that my body was getting into a bad place, and I needed to do something about it. Does that make sense? I didn't cure it in 6 weeks. I just quit and I haven't gone back. All right? But it was desperation, okay? I was in this place where I needed to do something. It was getting to be a dire circumstance, okay? Why would we care about making our marriage better? I think it's going to be, at least the answers I've come up with are these same 3, okay? Now, I think there could be more motivations than this. It's just in my simple thinking, just kind of working through some of this. This is the list that I've come up with. I think it's discipline. I think some people like working on themselves and working on the things that they're committed to because they just have this self-disciplined nature about them, and that's the thing that they become hyper-focused on, okay? So some people are obsessive about their relationships, their marriage, and so they're going to work on it. I think some people just want to. They know that it's good for them, and so they just have a desire to do the good things. They want to do it for the right reasons, okay? And then I think there's some people, when it comes to marriage, I think maybe most people, when it comes to working on their marriage, it's going to come from a place of desperation. They know that they're in a bad spot. They need to do something about it, and so they're going to start doing the work to take it seriously. Does that make sense? You got anything you'd add to that?
Yes.
Okay, what do you got?
One thing I'd add to it, okay? There's something that lays underneath all of this, which is that you assume that it's good. If you have a bad marriage, get another. Quit it. And so what lays underneath this thing, why would you discipline yourself unless you think that there is something better about where you're going than where you are? Why do you desire it so badly when another alternative is just to get out? This one didn't work. It's not easy. This one's going to take work. You know, why? Why would I go? Why would I persist? The desperation, you know, maybe you just feel that bad, but you talked about exercise. Some people don't care about looking like me, right? And
so they don't work out because they don't want to work for that.
It's not as big a deal, you know. Why do you consider it good?
Mm-hmm.
Why would it be better for me to be ripped than it is for me to be me? Mm-hmm. And so there's this. What lays underneath this thing is there's an assumption. Okay, you have to start with this notion that a good marriage is desirable, or that fixing this marriage is desirable. Okay. And then discipline, desire, desperation makes sense. I agree with all 3 of those things. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think you've got to lay alongside it these aren't the only alternatives, when you're looking at motivation. Why would I be motivated to fix my marriage when I think it'd be better off with her? I think that'd be easier, that it wouldn't take discipline. I don't have to worry about this desperation. Just quit. Start again. And so I think that's another piece that you got to lay. When you're looking at motivation, we're telling you that these are things that you can do to make your marriage better. Why? Try again. That's how a lot of people in our culture are. They don't see fixing a marriage as a desirable goal. This one didn't work, move on to the next. Does that make sense?
No, I think that works. Anything that you guys think that we're missing out when it comes to motivations?
I think obedience is something that has to be discussed.
Obedience?
Even talking about saving a marriage, into a marriage.
You got to wait. It's on his notes.
It's coming up.
It.
No, you're helping me out. It's interesting. I do a lot of premarital counseling for people. And one of the questions I ask them at the very beginning is I ask them, why do you want to get married? And especially right now in our culture where it's not necessary. It's quite acceptable in our world to just live together, to just play house, to live like you're married without actually getting married. And one of the consistent answers that I get from people, which again, you have to consider, they're talking to a preacher and they're wanting premarital counseling and they want to be married, right? And so there's several factors here to kind of eliminate most of the people who would be in these situations, okay? But the ones I'm talking to, quite frequently, the answer they give me is obedience. They feel like that's the right thing to do based on their understanding of what God has said, which is powerful and significant, which I think...
It's huge, Ricky. It's huge.
It's a huge piece. So if you take that back into gentleness, which we talked about Sunday, we asked the question, why would you care about being gentle? What's the motivation here? And I think I gave you three options, but I think they line up with these three that we've highlighted. I think one of them is just discipline, okay? So the first one I offered was the issue of sin. And I took it to Galatians 6:1, which I'm not expecting you to remember what that is. We're going to get there again later tonight, okay, and talk about Galatians 6:1. But we talked about how there's the warning, protect yourself because you may also fall in a trap, okay? That the potential of handling things in a relationship and caring for each other, that when someone is in the wrong, you be careful how you handle them, you restore them gently, because you could fall into a trap. And I'm making the case that one of those traps is harshness. It's the opposite of gentleness, okay? And so some people are going to be motivated to be gentle simply because they want to do what's right. They're good at just disciplining themselves to make the right decisions and to do the hard work. Does that make sense? They're avoiding sin. And the same kind of thing, these aren't drastically different, but the second piece would be obedience simply to Jesus, because they want to do what's good. They just have a desire within them to do the right thing. If you're that kind of person, kind of like me, I hate getting in trouble. I hate getting, even as a kid, I hated getting in trouble. So I always wanted to behave the right way, not because I wanted to be like a good person as much as I just didn't want to be in trouble, okay? And so there was the desire of obedience for me. That would have been big for me. And then the third one we talked about was just that it works. It just works. This is almost like a magic pill for your marriage. If you would be gentle with one another, your marriage will be better. And when I say that, you can take that in a lot of different places, okay? One of them for me, when I let my mind just kind of run down that trail, there's a selfish implication in this, okay? If you're in desperation, wishing that you had a better marriage, and oftentimes, we're going to talk about this more again here in a moment as well, oftentimes we think about the other person and what they're doing that's making this marriage so bad, okay? Selfishly, if I would be more gentle, it's going to make my marriage better, and I'm tired of where my marriage is at. And so I'm not doing it necessarily because I want to be gentle or because I even like my spouse right now. It's more because I just don't want to deal with the garbage of a marriage right now, and so I'm going to be nice. Does that make sense? Okay, it's almost like a cheat code for your marriage. Just be gentle, and it's going to work. It's going to make things better, okay? It can feel a little bit like manipulation. However, I think there's also the piece of this that sometimes you do what's right before you actually want to do what's right. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes in life, and this is, if you have kids or you've raised kids, you've probably been in phases where you've needed them to do this. They don't want to make the right decision, but they do anyways. And that's kind of a win. And eventually you make the right decision consistently enough. Eventually you start wanting to make the right decision, okay? Sometimes the desire follows after the obedience. And so I think sometimes this is what it looks like in marriage. Even if you don't have the desire to be gentle in your marriage, I think it's a cheat code. And if you would just do it, eventually your heart will probably turn towards wanting to do it. And it's better for your marriage either way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a good path. There's one piece that I think lays underneath it, because these all make the assumption that there's a God, right? If there's no God, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter. If there's no God, there's no sin, right? You think about it. If there's no God, there's no sin. If there's no God, then the whole idea of doing it because God says to is silly. And that's just one option. Be gentle or quit. If there's no God, who cares? What difference does it make? It works is irrelevant. Whether God is there or not is irrelevant. Okay? If it makes your life better, do it. If it doesn't make your life better, don't do it. All right? But I think these first two are predicated on the notion, which we believe there's a God. And if we believe there's a God, we believe there's such a thing as sin. And God determines what that is. And it matters. Because he's the one who's going to adjudicate those things. And if you believe that there's a God and you're a Jesus follower, that means he's your Lord, then obedience becomes a big deal. In fact, obedience becomes more important to you than your happiness. That's a tough one for Jesus followers. Obedience is more important than happiness. Okay? We think about happiness in the short term. Obedience is about thinking of something eternal. It has eternal consequences. And anybody who banks on the short term and ignores the long term consequences is stupid. And so I think the whole idea, what Ben is saying here, I think was dead on right. And because we're Jesus followers. If you're not a Jesus follower, do it your own way. Right? Does that make sense?
That's a good point. I just remembered something. This has nothing to do with the lesson. But if you were here last week, you remember there was that loud pop right at the end of the message? It wasn't this one. I have one just like his. But I was holding his. When Doc teaches, he asks me to do this so that he doesn't get distracted with the slides, and so I just try to keep it up for him. But he somehow rigged it. I think he pressed a button, and a battery exploded in this thing and threw acid everywhere, okay? And I didn't, when we left here last Wednesday night, I went downstairs and I could feel it on my fingertips. It's like I went down and washed my hands and everything else, and then went home. I was looking for something at the house, and all of a sudden my arm started hurting, and I looked and had a raw spot on my arm from the acid. I have these little bitty scabs still on my arm from the acid from this little game that he played. I don't even know how he did it.
He came in the next day to my office and complained to me.
And he laughed. It's his new favorite story. Anyway, for those of you who are concerned about me, you should have been. Doc is trying to kill me with battery explosions, all right?
The problem was he was holding it down here instead of up here.
Yeah. Keep it away from the eyes, for sure. Anyway, I'm that typical guy. So the whole time I'm holding this, I'm playing with the back of it, with the battery cover. I do that constantly. And so I was doing that all last week, and then all of a sudden it just exploded in my hand. It was the weirdest thing. Anyways, sorry. I got distracted, so I wanted you to be distracted with me as well. All right, so we dealt with motivation. Hard turn, okay? Completely different topic. The difference between power and authority. One of the pieces of feedback that I got from Doc last week was to differentiate between those two words because I used them interchangeably, okay? Well, I was talking about gentleness in regards to its relationship to power and authority. I use them interchangeably. They're not necessarily the same word, okay? But this is a direct quote from my message. After I kind of laid some stuff out, I said, what I'm saying is the foundation of gentleness is actually power, it's authority, it's the ability to use force, but choosing to restrain, choosing to be gentle, okay? Now,
and that was a huge point, guys. This was incredibly important. You need to understand real gentleness always comes out of power.
Yeah.
It doesn't come out of weakness. Otherwise, it's not gentleness, it's just weakness.
Yeah.
There's a difference between weakness and gentleness. People who are weak have to be mild. People who are strong choose to be mild. That's gentleness. A gentle man is a man who doesn't have to be gentle. That was a great point.
We're gonna go deeper in all that here in a moment. We're also gonna consider what does it look like to be in a position not of power, but to still be gentle. We're gonna talk through some of those kind of things. But before we get there, it's worth just noting the difference between these two words. Okay, so when we're talking about, go to the next one. There we go. Power is going to refer to the ability or the potential for an individual to influence others. Okay. So it's someone who can market, it's someone who can influence, it's going to be people in your life who you listen to, but they don't necessarily have authority over you. Does that make sense? They have power. The difference with authority is that there's going to be some sort of a legal or formal aspect to it, where if you give commands and you're making decisions, people are going to fall in line. You see the difference, okay? So authority is like professional power. When we're using this word power, we're just kind of referring to like the casual nature of influence and impact. Now, regardless of these two words and how they are different, both of them work in relation to gentleness, as we're talking about gentleness, okay? The idea, the concept is still going to work for both of them. And basically what we're going to say is this. There is a correlation, there's a correlation of power and gentleness, okay? And I'm going to go back to these charts that we looked at on Sunday that I'm very proud of because I made them. But nonetheless, it says the life cycle of power and the correlation to our capacity for gentleness. The case I'm making is that as we grow in our capability to have positions of power or authority, we also grow in our responsibility for gentleness. Does that make sense? Okay? That they're linked together. And that when you have more power, you have more ability to be gentle. When you have less power, you can still be gentle. That's one of the points that we're going to work on here. You can still be gentle, but it's not as impactful. Does that make sense? Okay? In fact, I'll put it to you this way. After my sermon, I had a young man come up to me and he said, hey, it sounds like you're saying that if you don't have power, you can't be gentle. Okay? Which as he said that, I kind of started thinking through it, and I was like, yeah, I may have given that leaning within the sermon, but that wouldn't be a practical understanding of what Scripture has to say. Okay? So it's not exactly what I meant. Gentleness has a correlation to power, meaning the more power, the more authority that you have, the more capacity for gentleness, or the more impactful, I think is a good way of saying this. If someone has zero power or authority and they're gentle, it doesn't have much impact. It doesn't mean a whole lot in the sense of it looks like subordination and obedience. Does that make sense? Okay? So if you're in the workplace and you're the boss and your workers aren't the boss and you tell them to do something or they treat you in ways that are gentle or kind, that's not really impressive gentleness. That's kind of just the order of authority, the chain of command. Does that make sense? However, and you know this because you've worked in those environments, you've had a boss or you've had a parent or you've had a teacher, you had a police officer who pulled you over one time, okay? You've had someone who had authority who didn't treat you gently, and it stuck with you. And you've also had people who were in authority who did treat you gently, and that's also stuck with you, okay? Because there's a correlation. There's a recognition that even though we gain more power and authority, it doesn't necessarily mean that we absolve ourselves from gentleness. In fact, I think it makes the case that we have more responsibility to gentleness. Does that make sense so far? Okay? Anything you want to say on that before we jump to these charts? Mm-hmm. Okay. I made these charts up. Okay? There was zero research done on this. It looks really nice and scientific. This is just me and my thinking. Like, there's nothing else to it, okay? I just came up with this. I was like, hey, this makes sense to me, but I'm kind of visual sometimes. I'm very mathematical. And so I was like, if I made a graph, this would make way more sense to me. So making the graph helped me think through it. And then I was like, hey, they probably want to see this too. Plus, I was proud of myself. So I created this graph, all right? And so we started by just talking about, like, just power, right? And working through these situations. Now, you can pick this apart really easy, such as babies don't have complete power. All right, they do in some senses. They have zero power in other senses, and so that's not completely accurate. Scientifically, we're going to break that down. Same with the toddler. But the emphasis of what I want you to see is that when we start out, we actually go through a process of losing power and authority in life. I think that's true, and I think it's true especially within adolescence. I don't know the last time that you've lived with a child who's between 10 and 14 years old. they make you convinced they have zero knowledge and zero power, all right? Like there's no reason that anyone should listen to anything that they have to say, okay? They convince you of that. But nonetheless, from there, as they start growing, they start getting more responsibility given to them. One of the things I have worked hard with my kids to teach them is that I'm going to give you small amounts of responsibility. If you handle it well, you'll get more. If you don't handle it well, you get less. But with responsibility comes freedom. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of freedom. If you're responsible with it, you'll get more. If you misuse it, you get less, right? That's how it works. We understand this. And so there's this sense in which you start accumulating those things back as you grow older into adulthood. And when you get into a relationship where you're married or when you're a parent, what happens in those relationships is that you've now linked yourself to other people that you have authority over. I don't know if you think about it that way, okay? But in a marriage, you've agreed to a relationship with someone where they have the right to speak into your life, to hold you accountable, to tell you what they see. You've given them a voice. You've given them authority into your life. When you have kids, they have to live off of you. They have to live off of your ability to provide and take care of them, to raise them, to teach them, to feed them, to shelter them, all those kinds of things, right? And so you have a human whose responsibility, who you are responsible for, and it looks like having that position of authority or power. Does that make sense so far? Do you follow me? Okay, so there's kind of the dip in it, but then it kind of builds throughout the rest of your life. Here, let me pick this apart. Pay attention to where this number's at. It moved, but it didn't. It's a 1 on both of them, okay? It's a 1. It's just that the chart that I made, the second one starts at a 0, so it changed the numbers, okay? Someone mentioned that to me Sunday, and I had to make sure they understood. And I knew it ahead of time. I'd seen this, but this was already like the 10th chart I'd made to try to perfect this and figure it out. And so I wasn't, like, I knew it on Friday, and I'm like, I'm not going to do this again. These are good enough. And then that one person saw it and picked it apart. Gosh. And I'm not married to her, and it wasn't Doc. And I'm being very gentle right now because I've not told you their name. Steve Smith. Anyways. Anyway. All right. When it comes to gentleness, okay, think about a baby. My sister was in my house over Christmas. They have a new baby that was born back in October. The baby has zero capacity for gentleness. Zero capability, zero understanding, okay? She also has a 2-year-old named Malachi. He has very little capacity for gentleness. He's learning. He's coming along, okay? He understands how to be gentle with the baby. Her name is Abigail. He's very sweet and gentle with her. And now they've been together, like she was born in October, so Malachi's been around her now for 3 months. And just last night, I called my sister. We're on FaceTime, and I'm talking to her, and she's holding the baby, and I'm talking to the baby, and then Malachi comes along, and Malachi wants to talk to the baby, and even now, my sister is still very terrified to let her 2-year-old around the baby, even though it's been months of him learning how to treat this baby. As I'm talking, he's coming up like trying to grab it by the head because he wants to do something with this baby. Very little capacity, right? He's learning gentleness. When he's gentle, we're shocked, we're surprised. He's a pretty rough boy to begin with. He's great. I love him to death. I find him hilarious, all right? But it's not my kid. That's why he's funny. Anyways, he's growing in his capability of gentleness, but that comes back to a major idea here. We aren't naturally gentle. A toddler isn't naturally gentle. You don't have to teach a toddler to get angry. You don't have to teach a toddler to fight for itself. You don't have to, those aren't traits that you have to teach them. You have to teach them how not to be those things, how to be able to restrain themselves, how to be able to have self-control. Those are the points that you have to teach, right? And then as it goes, you see it kind of move along, okay? I think an adolescent is more capable of gentleness than they are of power, all right? A 10 to 14-year-old is understanding gentleness at a higher level than they are being given positions of power or authority. But then from the rest of our life, I think they kind of walk hand in hand. They work together. The unfortunate thing is, and you could look at yourself, you could look at different people in your life, and you could say that this gentleness bar, for some people, doesn't ever go up. Some people don't learn this. Some people don't have the inclination to be soft or kind. Some people just stay below. And then what happens is as life goes and they're given more positions of power and authority, but they don't learn how to be gentle, they become tyrants. Very similar to the baby who runs the home, who just demands things and gets what it wants on its time. Adults can behave in the exact same way if they haven't learned gentleness. Does that make sense? Okay, anything else you want to say off of all this?
Yeah, a couple of things that are really important that I wanted to highlight. Number one, as you said, it's not natural. I believe that, okay? You guys, if you've been around here for a while, you've heard me paraphrase C.S. Lewis when he says that the job of a parent is to civilize a barbarian, okay? That's your kids. Your kids are all barbarians. You know, I remember one time I was interviewing a girl here for one of our children's ministry positions, and she scolded me vociferously for calling children barbarians, so I didn't hire her. But it's civilizing barbarians because they're basically completely self-absorbed. There is a linkage between continuing to be self-absorbed and being not gentle, because gentleness flows out of an ability to value others as much as you love yourself, right? Well, second great commandment. And so some people, as long as they still see themselves as more important than the people around them, putting number one first constantly, are going to struggle with gentleness. Gentleness is not natural because we all battle that selfishness, okay? One of my personal goals when I was about, I don't know, somewhere in my 30s, I think it was, finished, I was teaching at the college and that kind of stuff, but I looked and I began to realize I am not a gentleman at all. Gentleness was just not part of who I was. And so I set it as a goal. And it's been a war for a lifetime to learn how to be gentle, okay? Because I'm not naturally gentle at all, but it's God-honoring. But it requires the sublimation of self. And putting yourself last is hard. It's really, really hard, but that's what you're seeing here. When he said it's not natural, right? It's because we are self-absorbed jerks by nature, right? And we're trying to break that piece of us. All of us battle it. Even those of us who don't have power battle that selfishness. It's one of the reasons that they can be very ungentle, even without power. And so I think there's that linkage in it.
It is, and again, this chart is highly unscientific, all right? And so we could look through our lives and we could say, you know, maybe when I became a parent, my gentleness wasn't up there, but in the process of becoming a parent, it shaped me. It molded me. It helped me become a better version of myself, and I grew in that ability. I think I'm a more gentle person because I'm married and have kids. It broke me of some of my selfishness, and thank God for that, right? And so this isn't so much of this is how it always happens. Sometimes it happens in the wrong order, right? And I would even push this a little bit further, okay? I said earlier, if you've got the position of power, it necessitates gentleness because otherwise you become a tyrant. And if you go back through your life and you think through some of, one of the words that's very highly used in our world right now is trauma. If you go back and think about some of your traumas in life that have happened because of people, there's a good chance it has something to do with someone who is in a position of power who was not gentle. I think that's a trend, at least of what we see in counseling circles and some of those kinds of things. That's the normal, okay? So here, big idea, wrap all this up. Gentleness becomes more and more important and more significant as your power increases. If you apply this into the position of marriage or being a parent, your relationship with power and your relationship with authority has grown, so gentleness is even that much more important, okay? But where this is all coming from, I like to think about this from the other side. You don't have to be in a position of power to be gentle. It just makes it to when you are in a position of power and you're gentle, it's more significant, it's more impactful, it's more surprising, okay? If you go to Galatians 5:22, You're going to know this. This is the fruit of the Spirit. It says, fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness,
Let's get back to that
and
last one.
self-control.
I want to, one thing, because you made the comment on this, you don't have to be in a position of power to be gentle. Think of it in a situation where you've got a very unequal marriage, where you have one completely dominating the other. Let's go old school and say that it was an abusive husband and a wife. You know, today it can be reversed. You can have an abusive wife and a husband who's cowed, right? In any case, the one who is abused can lash out because of that abuse. You know, Proverbs says a gentle answer turns away wrath. What happens is that oftentimes we begin to lash and fight and all those kinds of things, and even in positions without power, you can respond without gentleness. And that's, I think, an illustration of the kind of point that you were making. I just didn't want to let that go by.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this fits back with Galatians 5.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't directed towards men. It's not directed towards women. It's not directed towards marriages. This is directed towards anyone who wants to be a Jesus follower. This isn't directed towards parents who have authority. This isn't directed towards people who are bosses who have positions of authority. To be a follower of Jesus means you take these things seriously. And so whether you have those positions of power or not, gentleness is something you want to take seriously. That's the big idea there, right? You can go even further. Titus chapter 3. Paul, speaking to Titus, who's helping lead a church, says, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever's good, to slander no one, to be peaceable, considerate, and always to be gentle toward everyone. I love that in the same sentence here, he says, remind the people to be subject to rulers, and he's also telling them to be gentle. Now, you don't have to be the ruler to be gentle. There's still an expectation that even if you don't see yourself as being in that position of power or authority, there is still a sense in which gentleness is something we're supposed to pursue because we follow Jesus first. That's the big idea. You guys, anything else on that?
Yeah, just interesting when you look at that verse, almost everything that comes before is an explanation of how to be gentle.
Yeah, with the idea of subject and submission.
Doing what is good, you don't have to. Slandering no person, because if you slander, that's opposite of gentleness. Being peaceable. Being unpeaceable is the opposite of gentle. People who are inconsiderate are not gentle. Mm-hmm. It's just that what you find here is almost, it flows into it. This is almost a summary statement.
Yeah. It's all your practical application of what it looks like to be gentle. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. Okay. All right, that's that section. Any thoughts or comments? Does anybody want to compliment me on the charts I made? I'd appreciate it. No? Did you like the charts, Ricky?
I'm an accountant, so I struggle.
You're picking it apart? Ricky, you're killing me. But you said it so gently. I really appreciate that. That was really nice. That's good. Okay. All right. We're going to step into some mud here, okay? I'm going to give you a chance to hate me and to have problems with what I'm going to say, okay? We're gonna take this into a space that nobody wants to talk about, not even me, but here we go, okay? We talked a lot about gentlemen. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about gentle women, okay? Doc said it just a moment ago, but I think this is true. Marriage looks different today than it did 50 or 60 years ago, especially if you just historically, culturally look through the movement of women's rights and what that looks like. The nature of the relationship in marriage is different today than it was 50, 60 years ago. And for some of you who are old enough to remember 50, 60 years ago, I think you'd agree with that. For those of you who aren't that old, I think you could probably recognize that the relationships of your grandparents or your great-grandparents is drastically different than the current picture and view of what marriage is today. It's just shifted. It's different, okay? And we've been saying gentleness has a correlation to power. In the past, based on the relational dynamics and the expectations of each sex, men had power, so they were the ones who desperately needed to practice gentleness. You think that's fair? Okay? You're all scared to say anything now. All right? Okay? And if you go back in time, as Doc mentioned just a minute ago, you have the prevalence of abuse, you have mistreatment from men during this time period. To some extent, I think we're still even discovering just how bad some of those marriages actually were at that point. We're still pulling stuff out, right? There was a commonality of men who used their position and forced to drive the relationship the way that they wanted it to go. And I think that we would probably agree that the state of marriage is a healthier thing now, as far as the respect of women and their roles and what that looks like, okay? I think it's been good, many of the things that have been accomplished through women's rights, giving them a voice, giving them a value and a respect that they have. I also highly believe that all of it's attributed to Jesus, okay? Women's rights doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless some guy came along and said that women had value, and that was Jesus. He changed the world, changed how people looked at that stuff, and it still took a long time before the context in which we're talking about, but I think it's deeply rooted in who Jesus was, okay? With all that said, that's a dangerous statement, all right? Women have gained rights. That means that they've also gained power. They've gained more authority, right? And we're saying that gentleness has a correlation to power. If men have power, they're the ones who have to practice gentleness, which means that if women have power, they're the ones who have to practice gentleness, okay? Now, I think historically we could say that women have always been considered the gentler sex, okay? I think there's truth to that. I also wonder how much of that is because of the position they've held historically, if they were forced to, okay? I don't have an answer for that, just kind of a question, okay? Because they've also been the one that's had less power, okay? Now that power and authority are more equal, the necessity of gentleness is greater for women than it once was, okay? I'm not saying that it's greater for women than it is for men. I'm just saying the expectation for women to be gentle is greater now than it ever has been. Would you agree with that? Okay? Which means that the temptation for women to not be gentle now is probably the greatest it's ever been. You think that's fair? Am I out of line yet?
No, I think you're being gentle.
I'm navigating as carefully as I possibly can.
I would be less gentle than you
Okay.
in this. You know, when I was young, it was a very patriarchal world. Would you buy that? Very much so. There hasn't just been an achieving of power for women. There has been an attack on masculinity and on masculine power, so that it is considered bad now. There has been a reversal that has taken place. It has gone from being very patriarchal, man-centered, to men are bad guys often, and it has swapped to the other extreme, okay? And instead of coming down to the center where we value each other, one that may have been degraded here now degrades the other culturally. I'm talking about as a cultural thing. And so women with power over men, because of the whole notion of intersectionality and these kind of things, you know, the fact is that it has reversed itself. And that is not God honoring. It is not God's way. Okay? And so, you know, I think what Ben is talking about very gently is there has been a swap that has taken place, but it's not because we've come here and so both have to be gentle with each other. In our culture, we almost have to address the ladies more harshly than we do guys because they've been attacking guys for being guys, right? And have assumed that power ought to be theirs. That's not right either. Okay? I don't think that's God honoring. You know, what we're looking for is that people being gentle with each other. People seeing each other as equally valuable or the other as more valuable than the other. In a marriage, a wife looks at her husband as more important than herself. In a marriage, a husband looks at his wife as more important than himself. You understand that? It's not moving from the husband looks at himself as more important or the woman seeing herself as more important. Neither one of those is God honoring. And so I think the transition that Ben is just trying to say it gently. I'm old enough that I don't care. I'll just go ahead and put it, I think a reversal has taken place, and that is terrible. And because of that, gentleness is something that has to be preached to both sides. Hard.
Well, I think what's interesting about this is that typically we talk about the role of gentlemen, and that's not a new title, okay? That's been something that's existed, I don't know how long, I don't know if centuries is fair enough to say that, okay? But the idea of man aspiring to be a gentleman has been around for a long time. I think the idea of a woman being a gentlewoman is probably a brand new concept for a lot of people, because I think we live in a world where that shift in power has happened in such a way that it's swung in a different direction for many situations. And so the idea that they would need to practice gentleness, I think, is still kind of a new idea and a new concept for most women.
Watch TV and watch how so many of the shows, how the women treat their husbands, right? How they demean them, belittle them. Listen in the foyer as wives talk about their husbands. And what you'll see is a cultural shift, right? And it's a sin, I think.
It's dangerous. Now, sounds like we're picking on women, right? And here's the deal. We've been talking about gentleness. We've talked about the fact that none of us have it, that it's a learned skill for all of us. When we were talking about the power and gentleness chart, we weren't talking at all about men and women. We're just saying in general that it's true, okay? And so what we're saying isn't necessarily not true of men. We're just highlighting kind of the women's role in this. And I've got this other verse here that I think is really, really interesting. This is from 1 Peter 3. This is a passage on marriage. He's talking directly to wives. And he says, wives, in the same way, submit to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles, the wearing of gold jewelry, fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. I use that just to say, okay? Anytime we're commanded something in the Bible, it's probably because it's not easy and natural to us. Okay? Anytime you have to be told to do something, it's because you wouldn't do it unless someone told you to. Okay? And so I think this is a valuable piece just to look and say, when it comes to instructions for women, the word gentle is something that's included here. Because it's very possible, especially in our culture, if this was true 2,000 years ago, how much more so now, it's incredibly easy for a woman to not be gentle in her marriage. Now, before we go any further with that, let's also recognize this, that in the Bible, you also have talking or language specifically for men when it comes to being elders and leaders. And within their expectations of what kind of a man they would be, it also says that they should specifically be gentle, which again fits with all these other passages we're looking at, like in Galatians and Titus, that says, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you need to be gentle. It's going to be true if you're a wife. It's going to be true if you're a husband.
Now, one thing that's interesting about this, I think a lot of people misunderstand what you get in Titus, because these are instructions to elders. And so a lot of people think if you're not an elder, you don't have to be that, right? Listen, if you read the guidelines for elders, all it's talking about is that you need to be a mature Christian. That's it. Everything there, well, apt to teach, perhaps not, but every character quality there that it talks about is just talking about be a mature Christian man, okay? If you're not an elder, you still are supposed to be gentle.
Yeah.
If you're not an elder, you're still not supposed to be a brawler. You're still not supposed to be a drunkard. All of the different things that it talks about in that text. It's just talking about be a good man.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be an elder, you better be working on it hard, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. All right, we got about 10 minutes. One of the interesting passages that looked at this past Sunday, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. This is not necessarily a marriage passage. I think it's really interesting if we hold it up against marriage. This is the verse we looked at. Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. Okay? Why would we restore them gently? Why is that important? Okay? I think that you could write this verse in a different way. I think you say, brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should truth him graciously. Think that's fair?
I like it.
Yeah. Some of you really like to truth people, all right? You need to truth him graciously, okay? Restore him gently, truth him graciously, okay? This is Jesus 101 kind of stuff. You're going to bring the fullness of truth, but you're going to do so in a way that it can be received, that it's done in a gracious manner. So restoring looks like truth. If you want to look like Jesus, then you've got to confront people with truth, right? But gently looks like grace. If you want to look like Jesus, you've got to be gracefully gentle. You have to be careful with the truth, okay? And so it's not just about letting people know the ways in which they can improve. It's about doing so in a manner that's gentle. Does that make sense?
Can I go after this? I mean, just a little bit further on this thing. One of the things that I say here periodically, because I don't know much, so I just repeat myself. But one of the things we talk about is that if you can't speak truth with grace, shut up, right? Because speaking truth without grace doesn't help people. It doesn't turn people towards Jesus, right? I would bring that to this verse. If someone's caught in a sin, you are spiritual to restore them gently. If you can't restore them gently, you're not the person to restore them, right? Because if you just speak truth without grace, the chances are you're not going to be restoring that person. Believe it or not, this is one of those things I was worried about. I am now wearing hearing aids, which annoys the bejiggers out of me because it shows that I'm old. But did you know that I can get a phone call and you don't hear it, but it's ringing in my ears? I just had that happen. I'm worried about wearing these when I.
It was me calling him to get him back for the battery acid from last week.
But this is a huge point, right? Truth and grace, if they're not linked, it's not God honoring.
Yeah, it's a really big idea. What we focused on even more so from past Sunday was that second part of the verse. Watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. And I said that verse typically speaks to, and if you've been around church for a long time, you've probably heard this taught, that's going to be, if you catch someone in a sin, be careful how you come along and help them, because you could actually get pulled into it. Okay, you got to protect yourself, you got to watch yourself. And I think that's legitimate, okay? I think that's probably the best understanding of this verse, okay? I think that's what he meant. I think that's a big idea. However, I think this other idea is just as legitimate, okay? I think that sometimes the temptation that we have isn't to struggle with the same sin, but it's to treat them in a way that they don't deserve. Does that make sense? To respond to them too harshly. And I think that's usually the case, especially in the context of a marriage, okay? So you think about a marriage, you think about some of the different fights that exist, some of the ways that you guys have disagreements. Quite frequently, if you're calling one another account to something, the temptation isn't that you want to do the same thing they're doing. The temptation more likely is that you want to be too harsh with them about your concern. Is that fair? I think so. I think that's fair, okay? And so have you ever, in your marriage, have you ever been confronted and you felt like you had to defend yourself, and then that conversation just kind of grows in intensity because you're being tempted not to be gentle? Have you ever blamed your behavior on your spouse? Right? Like, well, they raised their voice. It's not my fault that I raised my voice, right? Because you're tempted to not be gentle. Has your spouse ever repeated a behavior that bugs you? Right? And so if that happens, if that's likely happened in your marriage, where it's like not the first time that they've done something that's bothered you like that, but it's happened again and again and again, probably each time it happens, you're a little less gentle, right? Because there's a temptation to be less gentle as it goes along, okay? Each time you confront, it's harder. I think this is what, at least within marriage, I think this is a great application. Guard yourself. Guard yourself. Because your spouse's sin or your spouse's shortcomings are not an excuse for you to sin. Does that make sense? It's a hard thing to hear, right? Have you ever been in a conversation with your spouse where it started out because they have a problem and you want to address it, but by the end of the conversation, you have to apologize for stuff too? Okay? I think that's what we're talking about here, right? Like, it started out something simple. This wasn't even about me, but then I was tempted to not be gentle, and I found myself in a position where I had to apologize for my behavior as well. I think that's what we're talking about. Watch yourself. Guard yourself. Does that make sense? Anything on that one?
No, when Ben wrote that piece, and I read it because we read each other's stuff and comment on it and kind of help each other out, But this one caught me by surprise because I've taught scripture for a long time. I don't think I've ever read this take. And so I did a double take, and then I did a triple take, and then I went in to talk to him about it. And I think he's right. I think there's something here that's really, really important. I think this is a piece that is worth us pondering, okay? Because when you restore people, we are all tempted to do it wrong. And we do more damage sometimes than good by how we try to restore, all right? So it's a good point. I like that one.
One of the things I wrestle with this, okay, when you teach stuff like this, and there's a weight that I feel, I know Doc feels this too because we've talked about this, is oftentimes when you're teaching stuff, especially in the context of marriage, it's really dangerous because I don't know what happens in your homes. And I don't know the nature of every marriage that's going to be listening into the conversation that we have. And one of the great fears I have is that I would teach something that would make someone who's in a bad situation feel like they can't get out of it, or that they can't do anything to resolve it or fix it. Does that make sense? Okay? I'm thinking very specifically of a woman who's in a home who is being abused, and she hears me speak about how she has to be gentle. And so he's mistreating her, and he's going to do whatever he's going to do, and she's like, well, I'm following Jesus. I guess I just have to take it. That terrifies me, okay? Terrifies me. And it makes me look at all this, and it makes me ask the question, when is it appropriate to lose gentleness? When is it appropriate to no longer be gentle? Okay? That's a hard question that you have to work through. The problem with that question is that oftentimes we're too eager to not be gentle, and so we make up excuses all the time. That, oh, well, this is a situation. I don't need to be gentle with this one, right? We lessen the weight of this to what it looks like, okay? And then, think about this. Even this past Sunday, I talked about times when Paul was harsh. I talked about times when Jesus was harsh, right? There was time for it. So when is that time? When do I get to act like Jesus when he was calling people graves? And he was calling people snakes. And Jesus called people Satan. When do I get to act like that? Like, I want to be just like Jesus. When do I get to call names? All right? Like, that sounds more exciting and beneficial to me, okay? So when can I behave in those kinds of ways, okay? I think back to the Old Testament and the prophets and some of the very harsh, horrible, painful things that they said to the nation of Israel. There's times when they were not gentle, and they said very, very hard, mean things to them, okay? So when is that appropriate? What does that look like, okay? And I'm going to go back to kind of where we started this sermon series. It's that phrase, first comes love, okay? If you want to go to the Old Testament and the prophets, you've got to understand the reason the prophets are saying those things is because they're simply just relaying a message from God. And God is saying those things because he's madly in love with the people who refuse to love him. Does that make sense? His language, even though it grows in its harshness, is actually an act of love on his part in an effort to get their attention. Does that make sense? And his efforts, if you go Old Testament and you look through, quite consistently, the effort of God is for the people to repent and restore the relationship. Okay? It goes back even to that whole restore gently concept that we just worked through. Okay? He wasn't always as gentle as he could have been, but God rarely starts out like on a scale of 1 to 10 out of 10. It's been cycles of repeated behavior to God before his harshness gets to the level where you're reading it from the prophets. You think that's fair?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to a principle that the opposite of love is not wrath. The opposite of love is apathy. Sometimes out of love, you have to discipline harshly if that's what it's going to take to finally get it across. But you better make sure that that's not because of your anger and shallowness. And when you make the point that you do it as gently as possible, sometimes you're going to need to be harsher than that to get through. But if it's not motivated by love, it's not God honoring.
Yeah. It all goes back to love. And I like the phrase as gentle as possible, because that may mean there's times when you are harsh, but you're not as harsh as you could be. Does that make sense? There's times when you're letting the level match, okay? And I know that that's a gray answer, okay? Like, that's not very specific and that's not very helpful, okay? But here's some markers that I think could be really, really helpful for you, okay? In your marriage, especially in these contexts, when it comes to when is it appropriate for you to lose gentleness in your marriage, you should want what's best for your spouse, If you find yourself in a situation where you don't want what's best for them anymore, you want what's best for you, you're probably going to be too harsh. Does that make sense? Okay? It's an outward perspective, an outward thinking of them is going to keep you gentle. Okay? You should want them to be the best version of themselves, meaning that when you're holding them accountable, when you're bringing something up, and you've been gentle for a long time and you're losing your gentleness, the end goal still isn't for you to be heard. The end goal still isn't for you to get what you want. The end goal is that they would become something better, that they would be able to grow and be encouraged in that direction. Does that make sense? Okay? Your desire should be to see them reach their full potential. You're wanting what's best for them. You're wanting to see the best version of themselves. You want to see them reach their full potential. That's your purpose. The goal ultimately is to restore. Okay? So if you want someone to be built up, you're likely going to be gentle. If you find yourself in a situation, specifically in marriage, where you want to be harsh, be as gentle as you can be. And in that moment, make sure that your motives are to build them up, not tear them down. Does that make sense? Okay, for me, that makes sense, and I think that's a good barrier. I know it's kind of gray. It's not really, really specific, but for me, that's helpful in trying to think through levels of harshness and appropriateness and what that may look like. And if you want to see the opposite side of that, which I think is also helpful, at least in my mind, if you don't want to build them up, if you've reached a point in your marriage where you're not trying to fix them anymore, you're just fighting for yourself. And I know sometimes marriage gets to that, right? But if you're in that place, if you want to suffer, just unleash emotionally. You don't have to care about how harsh or how gentle it is, right? If you want someone to be wounded, then just be as harsh as you possibly can. If you want someone's will to break so that you can have yours, then just be unrelenting until you watch them cave. Okay? None of that has to do with gentle. None of that has to do with restoring them either. It has everything to do with you just getting yours. And I think that's oftentimes the dangerous thing. It doesn't look like love. When we play that out, it doesn't look like love of them. It looks like love of yourself. I don't think it looks like Jesus. You have anything else on that? Okay. That's a downer of a way to finish. It's 7:32. Guys, I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate you being able to participate and listen in. We're going to unpack this even more this next Sunday, dealing with humility, which is not gentleness, but they're so closely linked that it's going to reinforce again some of these big ideas. And so we hope that you join us for that. And also, I'm meant to advertise to you guys, we are doing a marriage retreat the end of March, March 21st through the 23rd. That's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's going to be a really good event. We've got a guy named Kurt Montooth, who's a counselor, who's coming in. He's going to help us with that. There's going to be 6 sessions between those 3 days to just kind of strengthen and help marriages. There'll be opportunities that if there's some damage in your marriage, there's going to be some opportunities to work on some of that and fix it. If you just want to get stronger, there's going to be opportunities for that too. And so it's going to be a good event. It's going to be down at Cumberland Falls State Resort Park. I'm going to be there. So Christina will also be there because I need to be there. All right. So hope you guys join us if you can. If you want to be a part of that, it'd be great. Doc, why don't you pray for us?
Father, we started just by reflecting on why we would care. Well, we believe there is a God, and we believe that you have our best interest at heart. You want what's best for us, and you know what that looks like better than we do. Help us to have soft hearts, receptive to the nudges of your Spirit. Help us to model for the world a different kind of relationship. They need it so desperately. And help us to taste the joy that you want each one of us to experience. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.